More to Marketing. Welcome to More to Marketing, a podcast on marketing, product, and everything in between. I'm your host, Susan, and today I have a very special guest. I have Richard here with me, who is a huge enthusiast of all things connecting CX, marketing, and digital together to make the best experience possible. He's worked for some of the biggest brands across Australia and also the Asia Pacific region, and has a huge passion on how to actually bring that knowledge into Australia and reshape it. But let's talk to Richard himself. Welcome, Richard.
Hey, Susan. How are you doing? Great to be here.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to have you here. Now, would you mind telling us a bit about yourself and your background?
Yeah, sure. So I've been working in and around marketing for nearly 30 years, which is absolutely terrifying when you stop and think about it.
I know what you mean.
Basically, I know, it creeps up on you as well. It's a bit scary. I've pretty much got three chapters to my career. So I left university with a degree in biology, which to the whole I haven't really used. I then worked in advertising for about 10 years in various agencies, both here in Australia and in London. And then moved into telco, where I met you when we were at Virgin Mobile, but also worked for a couple of other big brands like Vodafone and Optus. And then really for the last 10 years, I've been in FMCG, which has been really fascinating, particularly in the digital space. I worked for Nestle for a time, and then latterly with Haleon, which used to be GSK before they separated in the last couple of years. And it's been a fascinating process to talk about digital with those businesses in particular. They're often considered the last cab off the rank. They're not awash with data. They don't have those kind of rich digital services that other businesses offer. So it's been really great to be part of those companies as they've gone through their digital transformation journey.
And I know you've got so many learnings to share with us. We were going through before about topics for today, and you've got some really fantastic ones we're going to touch on. So, from the mobile commerce dominion of everything with data through social commerce, then a bit about AI and how it can be transformative to potential businesses, green practices, and also the rise of emerging markets, because I think that cross-boundary, cross-border is just growing and growing for a lot of businesses. And data and e-commerce is the heart of it. It has to all be utilizing that to actually be successful. But let's start having a chat in regards to the mobile commerce and its rise, or maybe not so great rise. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, so I'm going to take a slight step back before we go into mobile commerce, because I think there's a really important consideration here before we dive into some of these areas, which is the idea of digital commerce per se. So not e-commerce, but digital commerce. This is a term that really I've kind of hung my hat on. I think it's a really important distinction, and it takes a lot of digital transformation, digital marketing, and e-commerce, and combines those three separate areas into a holistic approach to really selling product online. And I think that's really, really important that we bear that in mind. It's not just about getting the consumer aware of the brand or making them aware of the brand. It's actually getting them to the point that they consider buying a product. And then also after they've bought the product, building that relationship with them over time and building advocacy around a brand. So digital commerce for me is the kind of the end-to-end process. Within that, mobile marketing or mobile commerce is a really interesting piece. Now, as I mentioned before, I've got a background working in telco, so I've kind of watched mobile commerce grow up from within. And, one of the things that I quite often talk about is back in 2007, showing my age a bit, we tried to launch, when I worked at 3, QR codes to try and drive mobile commerce and to get people to buy product from 3's portal off of a piece of paper using a QR code, off of a brochure. And of course, it didn't work. And now look at us now, post-pandemic, post-COVID, and everybody's kind of caught up and we understand how to use the QR code, and it's even built into the phone. So I think, mobile commerce has had a meteoric rise, but the foundations were really laid pre-iPhone. So 2007 was actually pre-iPhone.
And amazing to think that, because everyone just thinks the iPhone's been around forever.
Yeah, absolutely. So I still remember when, it was Nokia 6110 and, you had the Matrix flip phones that people would be using. And all of these phones, they did have access to portals. And a lot of those behaviors were kind of built in from that point.
Mm.
Now, when we look at mobile commerce and, user experience in particular, we've gone through a process of refining the online experience and shaping it to meet the needs of people that are using the mobile. And, there are some key markets in the Asia Pacific region that have led the way in that process. China is clearly one of them. Some of the work that's being done by large commerce providers like Taobao through Tmall or JD, you can see that what they do to make sure that they are optimizing and changing the mobile experience is that they spend a lot of time experimenting. And they will trial different pages, and they'll build optimization cues that over time mean that experience gets better and better and better and better. So it might be looking at banners and buttons and color and copy and offers, but they've got these very, very intricate optimization cues that allow them to evolve that over time. Outside of that, we know, mobile usage is growing still, which I still find quite breathtaking. In some areas, it's actually peaked. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about emerging markets further down the track. Those are the areas that I think we're going to see more mobile commerce, really grow. So the likes of Indonesia and the Philippines in particular, we'll talk about more, I'm sure, later. But they are the markets where, really they're going to be driving the next wave of mobile commerce. And as I say, any retailer, any platform that has set up an optimization queue, engaged with the consumer and begun to think, how do I get more from every single interaction? They're the ones that have really driven some of the growth that we've seen over the last couple of years.
I think for myself, watching how mobile has evolved, there's a lot of term used apathy out there because people are just over apps. Myself, I'm kind of feeling a bit over QR codes as well because everywhere I go, I need to now go in and find the QR code to be able to get, I don't know, my loyalty discount at a certain store or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
How have you seen that evolving in people's attitudes?
Yeah, it's a great question. So from an app's perspective, and again, I think the pendulum's really swung back and forth on this one, but on the whole, you're right. People don't like what's considered to be bloatware on their phone. They don't like having multiple apps. And actually, with the evolution of the internet, we've now seen that there is the capability just to have a website and actually to be able to manage everything through a site rather than through a native app on a phone. And I think that makes a huge difference. I think you're right around, the proliferation of couponing or the proliferation of vouchers. You and I were talking before. One of my passions outside of work is hiking and bushwalking. And actually, I've been looking at a lot of what's happening with Black Friday. So we've obviously had one of our big e-commerce retail sales over the weekend. We've got Cyber Monday today. And, I'm getting a proliferation of codes and emails as well. I think that, the business that cracks how to manage that will make an absolute fortune because you're right. There's too much that's happening. What I am seeing come through, though, are aggregators who pull together separate loyalty programs or coupons and actually group them together into one single app that makes it easier for the consumer to really relate to multiple different platforms or businesses at the same time. So Stocard, Stocard, is a great example of that and I use that on a regular basis. They're not just pulling in your grocery offers via Woolworths or Coles, but they're also looking at hiking businesses like Paddy Palin to try and pull them in as well. And you get all of your couponing, your discounts via that feed that sits within the native app. So I think for me, aggregation is the way forward. I think that will make a massive difference to mobile commerce. And I think it will make a really big difference to that proliferation that you're talking about that's making it really hard to cut through and to get the consumer, to get people to actually go into your store and buy when there's a sale on.
Exactly. And I think one of the things I saw that COVID did was it forced a whole older generation to learn how to use a mobile. with the shutdown of the 3G network within Australia and also the forcing of using QR codes to actually go into any store, that really did push a generation who, I'm making a big claim here, that probably a majority didn't bother with it because they were happy with just using their phone for everyday calls, not for anything else, have now learnt all about this new e-commerce that they could be part of. Have you seen many trends change with that change for that particular demographic?
Yeah, it's another really great question. So, my mother is, let's say, about to hit another big birthday next year. Do I want to tell how old my mother is? No, I'll keep that. I'll leave that to people's imaginations. I'll just say that I'm 50. So, add on my relative parents' age to that, and you'll get the idea of how old my mother is. I have seen in particular with her, and I'll accept that she's actually back in the UK, she's not in Australia. I have seen quite an interesting change in terms of her behavior, and not just, as you point out, the QR codes and some of the behaviors that we would have seen previously. I've actually seen a significant uptake in the number of people who purchased iPhones as a result of the pandemic and actually needing a richer digital experience within those older cohorts. That's something that anecdotally I've come across a lot, and I've read a little bit about within the Australian market as well. I also know that particularly, there's a lot of discussion at the moment about cost of living. There's a lot of discussion around that, bargaining and actually looking for opportunities. Some of the marketplaces that previously hadn't been considered by older cohorts are now beginning to be considered as an opportunity to purchase low-cost goods. So if you look at Catch of the Day or eBay, depending on the item, we know that those older consumers they're bargain hunting. They're beginning to look around and see where those opportunities exist. You've also got, particularly in Australia, the growth of Amazon, which has made a significant difference as well. So I know if I look at my in-laws over here, they are purchasing more on Amazon, and they're taking advantage of things like Subscribe and Save, where they can actually set up a regular purchase for a discount. And also, they don't have to think about that purchase as well, because it arrives at their door on a regular basis. So those are probably some of the key changes that I think I'm seeing with that older cohort.
I think one of the ones that I've seen, which actually goes perfectly into our next topic, is my mother-in-law found Facebook Marketplace. The good and the bad that goes along with that. But how have you seen the power of the social commerce really kick in now? So all these social media platforms.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the Facebook Marketplace thing is a really interesting one, and you're absolutely right. I think that's an area that has risen. That C2C concept, consumer to consumer purchasing, has definitely exploded during the pandemic. I know people were buying gym equipment in bulk at the start of the pandemic and then flogging it as soon as they were able to get out of lockdown.
Yep.
And again, I've seen a little bit of that grow as well. I think if we were to look more broadly and look at what's happened outside of Australia as well, I think there's some really interesting trends with social commerce on some of the platforms in other markets across the Asia Pacific region. And just to be clear, I think there are different forms of purchasing via social media. You do have social advertising. You have the ability to purchase product, one-click purchase within social media. And then there's social commerce, which is really more end-to-end integration with a retailer, with a partner. So you might be working with a Woolworths or a Coles to drive purchasing off of their website, but it is done via that social media platform. So it's a slightly different experience. It requires deep integration of your systems and your processes. You need to ensure that if you look at supply chain in particular, the integration between social platform and logistics for the retail platform will be very, very critical there. And otherwise, social commerce actually can't operate unless it has that deep supply chain integration. And we're beginning to see, retailers are beginning to drive some of this, the likes of Woolworths, the likes of Coles. They want to be able to provide that kind of opportunity for consumers to purchase their product. I think if we look at some of the platforms that are really beginning to bubble up across the APAC, obviously, we talked a little bit about China before. They lead the way in terms of social commerce. So Taobao, WeChat, so the ability to purchase within a messaging platform has become really popular within China. And actually, the Alibaba group is a very good way of integrating an end-to-end seamless consumer journey and using the data to actually ensure that the consumer is managed at every single step of the journey and that their propensity to purchase is increased. They actually use data signals to identify high-value consumers and then retarget them over time. So that sounds more complex than it actually is, and we're doing that in a lot of instances. I think WeChat in particular and the Ali group are past masters at doing that. But then, you've also got Tmall, you've got JD, you've got Pinduoduo in China as well. Pinduoduo in particular are using discounting, and the discounts increase the more people join a group. So that group buying, that group purchasing opportunity on that platform is one that I think from a social commerce perspective is really interesting and is really driving a change in behavior that potentially you could begin to see opening up in other markets like Australia further down the track. There's some of the kind of key trends. If I look at other markets, Shopee is a really popular platform in many of the Southeast Asia markets. We're also seeing live streaming come through, in particular on Shopee, as well as some of the other Southeast Asia platforms. That's driving a lot of social commerce as a result of live streaming events that are pre-scheduled, that the consumers are aware of. And actually, when they're around a particular category, you can see a significant uplift. I did see one thing around live streaming in China that I thought was fascinating last week, which was an influencer who she basically had committed, I think it was 5 seconds for every product maximum. And she did a live stream for about an hour. Oh, wow. And apparently the sales that resulted from that were higher than any other live streaming event that had been activated within a China platform. And literally when you watch the video, she's picking up a product, talking about it for a second, and then moving on to the next one. So her throughput, the number of products that she actually highlighted was significantly greater than any other live streaming influencer that had been on the platform to date. So again, we're just beginning to see people play with the format, play with some of the opportunities that are presented by social commerce, and certainly trends like live streaming will really play into that space and will really drive some of the performance that we're seeing within that particular trend.
Yes, no, I've seen some of this live streaming myself, probably more on the Meteoric kind of side where it's a bit more fun and quiche. I'm not sure if it was TikTok or Insta, potentially even Facebook. So it was a while ago I saw this, but 2 instances I saw was one, you could order whatever type of, what do you call them? Oysters and mussels that have actual pearls in them. And live, they would crack them open so you could see what you got, like what color. Was it a blue one? Was it a pink one? Did you get a double in there or nothing? And then people were ordering them then and there, and then they'll call out your name and go, I'm doing yours now, Robert, I'm not doing yours now, Samantha. So that was how they did that live streaming. Another one I saw, which looked absolutely crazy, was looked very Asian. And it was a lady with a giant scoop, and she was going into a big bowl and scooping out as much as she could in a certain time period to fill up this other little bucket of whatever these free little toys were that these people were live buying as well. And people were watching it, like hundreds, thousands of people were watching these events. And I just skimmed through it. I'm like, oh, wow, I don't know about that. I don't need to buy that, but that's pretty cool as well to see it.
Yeah, I think really understanding what, as with all good marketing, understanding what will resonate with your audience, what they're going to be interested in, depending on their demographic. If that floats your boat, if you're interested in seeing oysters open, then fantastic. Then give it a try.
I think just a few injuries seen there too.
I would think so. I think just to that point though, really understanding your audience is absolutely critical for social commerce. One of the things that we've seen on Douyin or TikTok in China in particular is the importance of authenticity around brands. So we actually, so that the company that I used to work for, Haleon, have done some incredibly good work in this space, working with their Sensodyne brand, and actually beginning to look at how they can create content that is really almost guerrilla, very much kind of street level, actually presenting use of the product, and even bringing in things like testimonials from users to actually advocate for the brand itself, rather than going out with a highly polished, studio-driven ad, effectively, that potentially would alienate people on the platform. And again, if you think of a platform like TikTok, which is a little bit more, it's certainly younger. It's not one that I can claim to be on a huge amount, but I know my kids are. You need to be in the voice of the platform. You need to be considering how your brand shows up in that space. And we've seen some really great examples of that. So authenticity, again, I think is really key.
And one question I was going to have to you on this whole social commerce, using platforms to buy through instead of through the shop itself.
Yeah.
How does trust come into that? Because these markets you've spoken about in Asia have already gotten, I suppose, almost to economies of scale. Like they've got WeChat and all the other ones you've just spoken about as well, that are very well known. They're culturally known. The culture within other countries is using it too. But how do you get that breakthrough to the cultural groups or even countries that haven't used it? What are some tips and tricks that you have seen to help those brands be able to get through to that trust?
So I think, trust around brand, if you're starting from zero, it's very, very difficult, and it does take time to build up that presence. I think, again, as with most brands, you're looking for reach, you're looking for advocacy through effectively likes and shares or similar. But the critical piece around product and purchase is reviews. So actually driving reviews online is an important part of what we would consider to be the digital shelf. And actually, going back to mobile commerce and driving mobile commerce, having a really healthy digital shelf for your product, where you have on the product purchase page the right primary image, the right description, the right everything in place so that the consumer gets all the information that they need is really critical. But as part of that, having consumer reviews and driving those reviews is really, really important. I often think it's quite interesting. One of the conversations I've had in FMCG is the concept of high versus low interest categories and whether or not reviews are relevant. I'm going to tell you now, they are for everybody and for every single brand, 110%. And there are always people that are happy to talk about your brand if they have either a good experience or a bad experience. So get the product right, talk about it, get it on the platform, and advocate for reviews, encourage reviews. If you're not able to incentivize reviews, so if you work in a highly regulated category, there are other ways to try and drive that aggregation of reviews. And working with your platform is a really good way to start that process, talking to them about how you can actually build up those reviews within the platform. The way that you do that changes depending on which social commerce platform you're working with or which process you're working with. But I would absolutely advocate for reviews as a really important part of the puzzle.
And I think that's a fabulous tip to be able to share with everyone as well. And a lot of this comes back down to technology and how we can utilize it best. So I know one of your passions is understanding and bringing in AI and personalization together as a powerhouse. Australia is still learning to do this. Most people now know what a ChatGPT is, but what else is happening in this space that we should be made aware of and that other countries are doing that we'll probably be seeing in the next, 6 hours, 6 weeks, 6 months?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Again, I'm a voracious podcast listener as well as contributor. So I was actually listening to one this morning that was talking about the advance of AI, and in particular, how the CEO of ChatGPT is really beginning to push the boundaries, having left the business and rejoined it within the last week.
Good way to get a pay rise.
Absolutely, great way to get a pay rise. But they're really trying to push the way that they collaborate with other partners like Microsoft and how they can begin to empower some of the services that are available through other technology companies. I think for me, there are a couple of key areas that we're going to see some huge advancements in. Probably the first is the concept of personalized recommendations. Now, personalization is a massive space within e-commerce, within digital commerce, not just in terms of the communication that we send out and our ability to personalize how you receive it, some of the preferences that are denoted with any communication that you receive, but also in terms of the recommendations that an AI tool could be presenting to you from a product or a service perspective. So if I go back to, wearing my previous hat of having worked in vitamins and minerals, the VMS category, we saw a lot of growth within that space where AI tools were beginning to take data from the consumer and actually then offer suggestions around the vitamins and minerals that they might like to take as a result. So you might go onto a website and you might answer a series of questions via a survey that looks at things like your energy levels, your sleep, the amount of activity that you do. And then as a result of that, you might get a bespoke VMS plan, a vitamin plan that meets your requirements. And all of that is AI powered. So that's very, very simple. I think what we're going to begin to see are some of these partnerships. And if you look at how potentially a VMS, a vitamin company, might partner with a Garmin or a Strava or any of those sporting data collectors, I think that you've got some really powerful opportunities to unlock real kind of well-being opportunities for business to try and really drive some tangible results for consumers who are looking to improve their everyday health. So I think that's a really exciting space. I think there are some other user experience changes that we're going to see more and more. I think people are very familiar with things like chatbots and virtual AI assistants. They're only going to grow and get increasingly more sophisticated. I am quite a frustrated chatbot user. I tend to find that I don't get the answers that I'm looking for. I genuinely think that will improve as the AI tools that sit behind them learn over the next couple of months. I think we're also going to see things like visual search come through. So, allowing users to upload images or use their device's camera to search for products. So we're already beginning to see, again, some of that, but thinking about potentially how that might impact both online and offline, your end-to-end user journey, I think is really interesting. There's a lot being done in predictive analytics already using AI. So how can we use the AI tools to get more from the data that's available from each consumer interaction? I quite often talk about how consumers leave their digital fingerprints after every interaction with a brand. And I think that idea of really unpacking that, connecting the dots between each interaction and getting more of a progressive view of a consumer. So understanding more and more and more about an individual over time, I think is really interesting. And I know that companies like Nestle are looking into that concept of progressive profiling over time as a really important part of their strategy. And then, you've got some of the areas that potentially people would immediately think of, things like fraud detection and security. So, we already get asked, are we a robot? Half the time that we're trying to sign in. Yep. There's an AI tool that tends to sit behind that. And then, dynamic pricing is another piece that potentially people are aware of, consumers are aware of. The price behind a product will change depending on availability, depending on demand. And we look at platforms like Amazon that potentially are already using that, or even airline companies will use dynamic pricing really, really quite efficiently. And then probably the last two things I've mentioned, augmented reality, we've kind of touched on the use of camera. And then I think that supply chain optimization piece that I mentioned before in terms of social commerce, we're going to see AI get more and more involved in really helping us track a product from order through to delivery and potentially beyond, potentially being able to help build that relationship between the brand and the consumer over time. So I think there are some really interesting areas, but you're absolutely right. AI for me is a really hot button. And I'm really excited to see where it goes. I'm not a doomsayer. I'm very much, I'm on board. I'm on board.
I think for me, one of the companies that really needs to get behind this and do it faster than what they have been, because I'm very disappointed in them, is Woolworths. So Woolworths X is this whole giant organization within Woolworths that is part of the engine of let's make everything better for the consumer. We're doing CX, but we're going to do it digitally led. And they're plugged into everything, anything you can imagine to make
Yeah.
everything beautiful.
Yeah.
But I'll give you an example here. I'll give you two. One, my cat passed away earlier this year.
I'm
Quite
sorry to
quite
hear
a
that.
few months ago. Thank you. Um, he had to, unfortunately. But little Carter, he had to pass away, and I'm still receiving recommendations from them for cat food.
Yeah.
I haven't had a cat for 6 months. I don't have another cat. I'm not planning to get another cat. Another one that really frustrates me in this whole progressive profiling is
Yeah.
I'm a mother with twins. And when you think baby formula, for those that don't know, baby formula comes in different stages depending on their age group for their first year or two of life. So you go from stage 1, 2, 3, 4, then you hopefully off it, or you might be on a different type of formula altogether. Very predictive. Very much, if you can work out when the first purchase is roughly made, you could go, okay, that lasts for usually 4 months, and then you could put in an algorithm behind the scenes. My kids are 2.5 at this moment in time. I'm still getting formula recommendations for stage 1.
Mm.
That's why is that even in my recommendation bucket at all? It shouldn't be. And that's where I think some companies really let you down as well in that experience from a customer point of view of why are you recommending me things that I 100% do not need?
I think that's a really interesting point. So, and I agree with you. I think progressive profiling is probably the key to answering that, and really just beginning to understand more and more about the consumer. I think one of the things that I get quite passionate about, people are often quite negative with digital advertising, and for me, provided advertising is relevant, and that's the critical word, I have
Definitely
absolutely
relevant.
no problem. And if there's a way for me to make advertising more relevant over time by sharing specific behaviors or information or data, then I'm happy to do it. Obviously, everybody is very, very conscious of the data that they share, and we need to make sure that data breaches are actively managed by the companies and the platforms that we operate with or that we share data with. At the same time, driving towards that level of relevance, I think is a really beneficial piece for both business, brand, and consumer as well. I think to your point, I'm always fascinated. So we have a number of listening devices around the house. I'm sitting next to a Google Nest here.
Oh, yes.
There's an Alexa in every room.
Your
There's a phone here.
phone.
And I'm always quite blown away when we're off on holiday at the end of the year, and I'll see an ad for a place that I've looked at on YouTube, but I've looked at it on the laptop up here. I always think that data connection is really interesting. And I think again, there is a role. You're right. There is a role for artificial intelligence to really help connect some of those dots and ensure that potentially we are getting increasingly more personalized advertising over time. I'm very sorry to hear about your cat. I lost a dog at the start of the year, so it's a tough time to go through. Very tough time to go through. But pet companies, if you're listening, please pick this up because it's not a nice experience.
No, not to be continually recommended.
No, fair enough.
And I truly, I 100% agree with you. It's all about that relevance, in place, right time, making sense. Creepy factor aside, consumers expect their data to be used for personalization these days. They expect that if I give you this survey, this questionnaire, this data on myself, you in return, because I know you're going to use my data for stuff, in return, I expect something. So to have relevant products recommended or relevant reviews to read and see how to, or even recipes, whatever it might be, there is that relationship where it's supposed to be reciprocal. And a lot of businesses are still failing with that. And that I agree with you. That's where the AI can come in and be part of that story to make it more personalized at the same time as relevant.
Love it. Completely on board.
So sustainability and green practices, it's definitely topical. Everyone is talking about carbon, no plastic bags anymore. What can we
Yeah.
do to help the environment? What have you seen in trends when it comes from all of like the Asia Pacific region that we should be looking at as part of our practices?
Yeah, it's a really important piece, I think, for e-commerce. So first of all, I will say that I think it's fair. FMCG companies are really struggling with this across the Asia Pacific region, and mainly because quite often some of the e-commerce packaging initiatives that come out are very costly to try and set up and manage. And one of the big challenges that e-commerce has is the concept of how much value it creates for the broader business. So if you look at, e-commerce is only 3% to 5% of your business in some categories. If it's only 3 to 5%, then actually making those changes around packaging can be quite cost prohibitive unless you look at the longer term benefit and you build in some of the brand benefit at the same time to the consumer. What we're seeing, and some of the platforms that are helping to try and get over that, are platforms like Amazon, who are actively trying to drive ship in own container, or SIOC, SIOC, and then also FFP, or frustration free packaging, as two initiatives that they think will create a great consumer experience. Now, that's everywhere that Amazon is. So if I look at the Asia Pacific region, Amazon's big in Japan, it's big in India, it's big in Singapore, and obviously we've got Amazon here in Australia as well. So there are some really great markets that are already looking at doing some of this SIOC and FFP opportunity as well. I think the other piece is really trying to, some of the companies that are really doing this, like Nestle, are beginning to look at how they can operate closer with their supply chain in order to shift the way that e-commerce operates. So having an individual who is responsible for e-commerce within the supply chain team is a really good starting point, and actually beginning to say, okay, well, what are we doing around green packaging? How do we ensure that everything that we've got is eco-friendly? How do we ensure that it's recycled? How do we ensure that it's biodegradable? How do we reduce the environmental impact of packaging overall? How do we reduce the packaging waste? So I know that I've had both ends of the spectrum in terms of experience when I've received e-commerce products. So I've had, on the one hand, it's been a ship in own container product where I've opened it up, there's minimal packaging, and I've got the product. On the other hand, I've had the experience where I've had a massive cardboard box arrive that's filled with paper, and on the inside the product is only, yay big, but it's in a box that's this big. So having somebody within the supply chain organization who's responsible for looking at that, and again, green packaging, reducing packaging waste is really important. The next thing that I'm seeing businesses do really well is begin to look at carbon offsetting as an option to really try and drive some of that change in behavior that happens within organizations. So looking at how you can offset your carbon emissions from shipping by investing in projects that reduce or capture the equivalent amount is a really great way of building a program. And again, Amazon's a great example of an organization that's trying to drive that. They've actually had green certification in other markets like the US for some time now. I know that in the next couple of months, they'll be looking to bring that green certification into Australia as well, I believe in the next 6 months. And, that carbon offsetting piece, I think, will be part of that program as well. So any organization that takes a step forward and that looks at their carbon footprint and how they might offset, and there are organizations that are out there that can help you actively work out your carbon footprint. That's a really important part of it. We've talked about supply chain. I think, again, working with suppliers, manufacturers, platforms, actually building that end-to-end journey for the product, I think, is really important, and looking at it through an eco lens. And ultimately looking at the product life cycle and the considerations around that are really important. So for me, there are a couple of really simple pieces that we could be doing immediately that I've seen good business do. I know that, again, former company Haleon have started looking at this as well. Things like energy efficient operations. How do you optimize your energy use in warehouses, within offices, within data centers? using energy efficient lighting, heating, cooling systems. All of those things do play into the digital commerce space. And again, this is kind of the interesting, I go back to what I mentioned at the start. Digital commerce really is more than just the digital component. It is more broad than that. It actually looks at all different parts of the organization. And, you know, if you're talking about the lighting that's used in the warehouse, you couldn't get further away from digital if you tried, really. So I think there's some really interesting pieces there. I think, you know, being able to encourage consumers to only opt into your brand or to opt into your brand because it is seen as an eco brand, I think is really important as well. So the way that you advertise via digital commerce is important. Having that certification from a platform like Amazon will really help with that process. Building waste reduction programs as well, again, to kind of mirror what you're doing within the supply chain team, and actively, you know, implementing those programs and talking to the consumer about what you're doing to make a difference, I think is important. So that element of transparency and communication to the consumer is really important. And then, you know, from a digital perspective, and this is probably the last thing I'd say, looking at the digital solutions that you could be putting in place, not just via digital commerce, but also thinking about the relationships that you've got with retailers like Woolworths and Coles. And in the past, I've tried to build that into things like joint business planning processes, JBPs, where you do have an opportunity to say, okay, how can we work with you to create digital receipts, to create digital invoices, to reduce the amount of paper that's used within our organization from a B2B perspective as well as a B2C perspective, to really try and build a more ecological or ecocentric supply chain process or product life cycle within the e-commerce realm. So I think lots and lots of ways that we can do that to try and shift the dial.
I think there's definitely a whole pile of opportunities that even smaller businesses can look into, just as simply as how do you use your energy could just be one that they could just tackle straight away and go, you know what, I can turn off the PowerPoint. Even something so simple like that can make a difference.
100% agree. I wish my kids would do the same thing at home.
Now I'm going to go to your final favorite topic of them all. We've left it to last because I know you really want to talk particularly about Indonesia and the Philippines, but emerging markets and the focus that we should be getting. What should we be looking at, and what do you think should be where we're going to go with what you've seen come out of those markets at present?
Yeah, great question. So, and this is my favorite topic. So I think it's one of the things I've really enjoyed being in an Asia Pacific role for the last couple of years is actually looking at different markets in their stage of maturity. So yes, you've got markets like China, which are significantly further ahead than the rest of the APAC region. And actually the reason that they're so far ahead is because I think that they've unpacked data, they've unpacked user experience, and actually they've used their data to empower and optimize the user experience over time, going right the way back to what we talked about at the start by building those optimization queues. And that's now what we're beginning to see come through in some of the other markets. I think obviously what we've seen over the last couple of years, particularly with the pandemic, is that digital maturity curve, every market has accelerated really hard as a result of the pandemic. And we actually had this huge shift to online. We had some markets that were growing at 200% and 300%. And Indonesia, you're absolutely right, and the Philippines were right up there as markets that grew. Outside that, we also saw Vietnam grow significantly. Thailand, we're seeing a lot of change as well. And then you've got markets that did grow but are beginning to slow back down again. Markets like Taiwan, where they are a very big e-commerce player, but at the same time, they don't have the same level of opportunity that you'd see in a market like Indonesia or the Philippines. I think one of the critical things, and we talked about this before, that these markets are getting really down pat, what they're really working on hard is that digital shelf presence. And what they're looking at is three concepts. And we talked a lot about this when I worked with Haley on, is findability, conversion, and performance. And being able to look at How do I ensure that my product is findable? So looking at things like search, how do I build in organic search? How do I have the right paid strategy? And then once you've got the consumer on the page, on the platform, and the key platforms I mentioned before in Southeast Asia are the likes of Shopee and Lazada. And then when the consumer arrives, how do we get them to convert? What is the offer that we're providing to the consumer? And then after that, how do we ensure that we're building that performance over time? And that really plays into the review space, that advocacy space that we talked about previously as well. That FCP, I think, is what's driving, along with that user experience piece, is what's driving the growth within those markets. And what's happened actually is that consumers have gone online. They're able to find the product better than they could before. They're able to see where the offers and the discounts are. And then what's happening is that brands are actively following up to try and build that advocacy over time. And that behavior sticks. So what we see in digital commerce is people will move online, they'll purchase the product, and if they have a great experience, they'll stay with it. They won't move back to the offline channel. Having said that, a market like Australia, we've actually seen consumers go back into the stores, and that's been an active drive that's been happening by our grocery companies over here, where they want to see consumers in the store browsing for product and actually potentially picking up more than they would have done in the online basket. So Indonesia and the Philippines in particular, I think are really interesting markets because they've gone through that accelerated change over the last couple of years as a result of the pandemic. And now, having focused on the FCP piece and having built up that optimization queue, I think we're just going to see them continue to grow more and more and more. You've got underpinning that as well, two critical pieces. One is the growth of mobile, which we still know is growing significantly within the Southeast Asia region. And then on top of that, you've got the logistics and the supply chain piece. Now, if you think of Indonesia in particular, you've got a large number of islands that make up that regional area. So the logistics piece is very difficult, getting the product to the consumer when they've ordered. What we're going to see over the next couple of years is that the logistics piece will get easier as those platforms grow, as the Shopees and the Lazadas grow, and they actually begin to get a foothold with their logistics framework, their network, by either partnering or by building, and actually being able to get the product to the consumer faster and faster and faster. So I don't expect to see that changing anytime soon. If you were to take some of those key things and try and apply them to Australia, I think, some of the messages that we've talked about all the way through today are really critical. You have to get your digital shelf health up to scratch. If you aren't looking at how your product appears, primary image, secondary image, your description, your product titles, if you aren't looking at how consumers search for your product as a result, if you aren't looking at the offers that you're presenting to the consumer when they get onto the page, and then building that relationship subsequently via things like reviews, you're going to lose the consumer within the journey. So I think those are really critical. Having the right supply chain, having the right people in the supply chain team as well, who can begin to look at things like environmental opportunities and who can begin to build your product and your presence on platform is absolutely critical. And then, being able to ensure that you follow up as well and you build that advocacy with the consumer over time through things like ratings and reviews will really give you that end-to-end piece. And those are the key areas that we're seeing in those emerging markets, and they're probably the key areas that I think we can pull through to Australia and the Australian market for any business that's looking to grow now.
And exactly, they're transferable, aren't they? There's some things that are just almost hygiene that they could start bringing in to be able to reap those benefits.
100%. Yeah, I agree completely. Yeah.
I have loved our conversation today, but I always end with one final question. What brand, if any in the world, best represents you and why?
It's a great question. I love answering this question. So I'm going to pick a brand that people may not have heard of, but I'll explain why I pick it. So it isn't a big brand like a Nike or a Sony. It's actually a brand called All Trails. I think I mentioned to you before that I'm an avid bushwalker and hiker.
Yes.
I love getting out into the Australian bush and forest bathing, I believe we call it. Getting a little bit of nature, rewilding. It's a very important
You
part of
might
who
be
I
able to
am.
trademark that phrase.
I don't think I can. I think it's already. I think it's taken. But it's yeah. So it's something I'm very passionate about. All Trails is actually a San Francisco-based digital company. They have tracked every trail in Australia, and actually they've created a social network that allows hikers to go in, find the trails that are near them, pick trails based on difficulty, grading, on the length of the trail. You can go in, you can share your feedback on the trail. You can actually track your progress around the trail, and you're able to see your progress over time, which for somebody that's competitive like me, I actually really enjoy. And then you can also take photos of the trails and upload them. They're a really progressive digital experience provider, and I really love them for that perspective. But also because they just have a love of the great outdoors that I personally share as well. So they're not an Australian business. They are a small business, but the way that they present their user experience, I think really sings to me. And they're certainly a brand that I really enjoy using.
It sounds like it's a perfect fit for you. A bit of digital, a bit of nature, all combined together, mixed in with
100%.
great photos and enjoying
100%.
yourself. I think that's a really good one.
Thank you.
I would just love to do a sum up because we've learnt so much today from you. So the biggest call out for me is it's all digital commerce where you've got transformation, marketing, e-commerce all coming together. It's not just one or the other. You need to think of it as a present with all these fantastic gifts inside that all work together. Mobile commerce, you need to do some experimentation. There's a lot of people out there just do a set and forget, but optimization is key to be able to iterate like some of the Asia Pacific markets have been doing. Ensure that you look at how social commerce trends could help you, but make sure to be authentic and be true to your brand if you do go down this path. But there may be some opportunities there that we're seeing in emerging markets for purchase trends. So definitely something to look at, particularly if you're more culturally sensitive, depending on what country you're from. But no matter what, reviews are critical. If you're not ending your journey through a purchase with asking for a review, whether you give them something for it or not, you're not going to get much out there when it comes to social. So you need to ensure that you've got that coming back with some feedback to you, coming back with how they love it or may not like it is also gold for you. So ensuring you're continuing that conversation out there in a positive way. Artificial intelligence has so much to offer for us. If we start looking at how we can collaborate with it and our partners, we may be able to create some fantastic solutions for doing some personalization for recommendations through to progressive profiling. There's so many good things here. And then adding the layer of also sustainability and green practices, you can then also look at how can you improve what you're delivering, whether it is within the business itself or how it's going out to the actual consumers by looking at your energy efficiency, certification, also waste reduction. But again, joining up with a partner can help you. So definitely look at if there's any digital solutions where you can work together to make a benefit for both of you and also that customer. And emerging markets itself, there is so much out there, but it all comes down to data and user experience. Make sure that you're pairing both together and continue optimizing and testing. And that's how some of these markets have come ahead. They've already spent that time and invested in it, and it's worked. They're reaping the benefits. So it's time for other companies to start doing that as well. And last but not least, look to see if you can put someone in the supply chain that actually has a focus on digital e-commerce. It will help it have more of an integrated feel within the business so that you're getting a better result overall. How'd I go, Richard?
That was absolutely brilliant. I couldn't have done it better myself. Thank you. No, that was perfect.
Thank you again so much for your time, Richard. Is there any final thought you want to leave off?
Not from my side. Just thank you so much for having me today. The only thing I will do a slight small self promo, which is just I have set up my own business, Digital Moose, which is a consultancy that looks at digital marketing, digital transformation, and digital commerce. And please, anybody that's interested, if you'd like to know more, please look me up on LinkedIn.
Fantastic. Thank you again, Richard. And that was Digital Moose. I'll make sure to have it in the notes from this podcast. Thank you again. For everyone else, make sure to follow More to Marketing for some more fantastic podcasts with excellent guests. More to Marketing.